In 8 years and nearly 250 episodes, I think most of you who have stuck with me for so long have come to know what, in my view, makes for a good and a bad TV show. So, in closing out this season, one question comes to mind. What happens when something comes along that turns your standards upside down? How do you review something that you actually like when all accounts say you shouldn't? Dan vs. is a show that quite a few people may still not know about. That's because it was distributed by Starz Entertainment, a group mostly known for producing a poor man's version of HBO, and aired from 2011 to 2013 on the Hub Network, which kind of buried almost everything else it aired in favor of one particular show. I await the comments from bronies everywhere. The point is, the show did build a cult following from the 3 years which it aired. And the thing is, I can actually see why, even though on the surface, it's exactly the type of show I've berated since almost day one. You see, Dan vs. is about an asshole. The entire show is about an angry, arrogant, uncompromising jerk who lives his entire life believing that pretty much everyone and everything is out to get him. Its title character pretty much reflects the absolute worst aspects of humanity. And yet somehow, it actually manages to do it in a way that's entertaining. I know! After all the adult cartoons I've reviewed and railed on before involving jerk-ass characters, what makes this the one exception that manages to pull off the concept well? Let's try to find out as we close out this spring season of TV trash with Dan vs. As pointed out before, Dan has a terrible life. He has no regular job or source of income as far as it's known, and lives in a filthy, crumbling apartment in the slums of Los Angeles. He has to deal with conditions like being so lactose intolerant he can't even have cheese on his burgers, to say nothing about what a simple milkshake will do to him. So many obstacles in his life have made him into someone who expects failure and disappointment, and thus needs to find something to lash out at in response. And I guess he can't afford good enough internet access, so he just can't create his own online review show. This leads to him frequently engaging in vendettas and missions of vengeance against whoever or whatever he thinks has most recently wronged him. Usually dragging into the fray his best friend Chris, who is voiced by former news radio star Dave Foley. Meanwhile, Dan is voiced by Curtis Armstrong, whose biggest roles prior to this likely have been that of Snot Lonstein on American Dad and Kuzco's teacher in The Emperor's New School. And yes, these characters were named after the show's creators, Dan Mandel and Chris Pearson. Now, of course, one can always argue that Dan has no one but himself to blame for all of his problems. Even though it's never truly stated if this is the case or vice versa, one could argue that his whole life has been the result of his attitude, and that all he does, viewing everything with such negativity, is only making things worse for him. Why am I having flashbacks to several lectures family members have given me over the last 8 years? The antithesis to Dan is obviously Chris. He's much friendlier and has a more positive outlook on the world, and one could claim that's why he has a much better life on the surface. A beautiful wife and his own home in Van Nuys. However, beyond the surface, Chris really doesn't have it all. Just like Dan, he often doesn't think before he acts, just doing so with a more naive mindset than the more jaded one that Dan has. He himself has bounced back and forth between jobs in a struggling economy, suggesting that he essentially has to live off of his wife. And yeah, we'll be getting into what she does later on. The dichotomy between a Dan and a Chris is as old as time itself, but how did these show creators essentially make us root for the bad guy in this situation? Well, it wasn't that hard, because that's pretty much what the audience wanted. Dan may be, for all intents, the biggest guilty pleasure created in a long time. While most, if not all of us, have said at one time we want to be the clean-cut good guy of any story, the truth is most of us at some point gravitate toward characters that do things we wish we could get away with. And in Dan, the show has created someone that the cynic in many of us can live vicariously through by making him an angry, hateful character that we can still sympathize with. First off, a lot of Dan's vendettas are against things quite a few people can understand in some way. He goes after someone who damaged his car. He goes after tech that becomes obsolete too soon. He goes after the bank because of their ATM fees. He goes after the Salvation Army. Hey, I know people who hate the Salvation Army. And it's not just the fact that he's doing these things, but also the blatant honesty in his motives. He wants to get rid of traffic, not to reduce pollution, but just so he can drive the freeway more easily. He wants to destroy the local big box store, not because of it ruining small businesses, though that is mentioned, but just because of the noise and parking problems it's created in his neighborhood. See, many of us say we want to fight injustices in the world for supposedly idealistic motives, but in reality, we usually have our own personal selfish objectives behind them. But despite being vindictive and selfish, Dan isn't someone you can call completely evil. In the first episode, he deduces that a wolf man was the one who scratched his car, and most of the episode makes it look like he's planning to kill the creature. But when they finally find where the wolf man lives, he just keys his car in an eye for an eye moment. Then there was the time he looked to blow up the animal shelter near his apartment because the dog barking kept him awake. Well, not only does he release all of the animals before the place goes boom, he also takes in this sad little kitty from the place, which he keeps for the remainder of the series. In a way, the kitty Mr. Mumbles becomes even more of a close friend to him than Chris is. But the show goes even further beyond the idea that Dan is a vicious person who still has some level of scruples, because more often than not, Dan turns out to be right. I mean, not only did the Wolfman exist and did damage his car, but there was also the time he wanted to get back at New Mexico by ruining its hot air balloon festival, and the balloonists were also satanic cultists. He was right about a ninja stealing his cookies because the ninja in question was from a clan that steals baked goods, and also had a vendetta against Chris's wife. Even when Dan tries to eliminate said wife's parents by telling the police they're with the mob, it turns out the mother is actually in the mob. I don't know what's more insane, that or the fact that said parents are voiced by ex-Family Ties stars Michael Gross and Meredith Baxter. And yeah, that leads us into the elephant in the show, Chris's wife Elise. Elise is basically a female version of James Bond. Actually, she may be a better secret agent than Bond because she can actually keep her cover, even from her own husband, but that's not saying much because Chris ain't exactly the sharpest tool in the box. Dan apparently doesn't know all the details about what Elise does, but she does often get involved with his plans using her spy connections and technology, and he just seems to roll with it. I guess he doesn't look a gift horse in the mouth. But yeah, Elise is about as badass as Natasha Romanoff without the horrible backstory. Maybe it's my own love of action females, but I just can't agree with the supposed large number of the show's fans who say she's the weak link of the whole series. They claim she doesn't fit in with the narrative, like her presence is too nonsensical. My response to that? This is a show where one angry loser wanted to destroy all of Canada Canada by triggering a massive avalanche from one giant glacier. This show is not supposed to make sense. To me, Elise is just a huge reflection of the overall ludicrousness and non-realism of the show and how you just need to run with both the comedy and campy action the show provides. I mean, the ninja episode had a scene where she's fighting the ninja on an overpass while so many cars are driving along and no one's paying attention like it's just another Tuesday.
Daddy, there's a lady with a sword fighting some guy in pajamas outside.
Yes, son, they're just transplants from Florida. And then there was the time she aided Dan against New Mexico by bombing Santa Fe War of the World style with Area 51 technology. And when she helped him get revenge on the big box store using a shrink ray. This show is like if Phineas and Ferb was written by Lewis Black. And the fact that Elise is a tough cookie provides the final ingredient that this show really needed. She's the one person that can stand up to Dan. While Chris almost always gives in to Dan's plans, she's the one who can stop him if he goes too far. She obviously doesn't like the fact that Dan is constantly getting her husband into danger and trouble, but she herself is no angel, having her own vendettas. In a way, Elise is perhaps even more reflective of the audience than Dan is. A good person at heart who still kinda has a bit of an evil streak to her. And that's an important factor because the biggest question of all is, are we bad people for liking something like Dan Versus? Maybe in the strictest sense, but that's just because we're only human, with both good and evil sides constantly fighting to balance one another. And that's one small example of why this show works where so many others didn't. The balance and putting our moral structure into question pretty brilliantly. Dan Versus is reflective of its time when animation has been more and more used to deconstruct the morals and ideals that the medium lived by for a long time. But it succeeds in doing so by adding very subtle depth to its characters. The issue with adult cartoons like Brickleberry, Alan Gregory, and the Nut Shack is that too often all of the characters are jerks just for the sake of being jerks. The creators seem to think we want to see these people treat each other horribly, but they don't adequately explain why they do that. There's no rationale given for their actions and attitudes. Dan has purpose. We are shown exactly why he does what he does, and it's presented in a way where we can see us at least wanting to do the same. In addition, his jerk-ass behavior is evened out, not just by the occasional act of humanity he may commit, but also by the other characters. We get Chris's blind positivity and naivete to contrast Dan's jaded mindset, and then we get Elise, who is basically a combination of the two. It tackles issues we deal with every day that may not seem like much in the grand scheme of things, but still drive us insane from having to constantly deal with them. And by creating someone who enacts revenge against these pet peeves of ours, even in the most insane ways possible, it allows us to have some level of catharsis. If anything else, this show is also a sign that any creator can be redeemed, as one of its directors was Bill Kopp, the guy who created Schnookums and Meat. The show is unfortunately only available for purchase on Amazon Prime as far as I know now, but hopefully as many of you as possible can check it out and judge for yourself as to whether or not it's worth liking. And please adhere to the don't try this at home mandate when watching it. We here at Rowdy C Productions certainly do not advocate resorting to the tactics Dan uses.
Our new revenge malware program is complete. Should we hunt down Ajit Pai's email server?
See you next time on TV Trash!